Welcome to the debate. Today we are diving into the analysis of, well, a really significant and frankly quite complex event in modern American conservatism. The Charlie Kirk Memorial Service. This wasn't just any memorial, it was a massive national spectacle. Tens of thousands attended, top figures from the MAGA movement were there, and it was broadcast everywhere. So the central question we need to grapple with today, and it's crucial for understanding the forces shaping politics right now, is this. Was this event fundamentally a profound spiritual revival focused on faith, forgiveness, the gospel, or was it actually a very calculated political staging ground, designed perhaps to mobilize a youth movement, brand Kirk as a martyr, and really accelerate an antagonistic political agenda?
Exactly. And the whole debate really turns on how you interpret what happened there, that mix of powerful, seemingly genuine religious testimony right alongside major political players like Donald Trump and J.D. Vance making very pointed statements.
And that's where we differ. I would assert that the memorial was overwhelmingly a spiritual event, an authentic, you might even say, revival moment, really dedicated to Christian faith and forgiveness.
Whereas I see it differently. My contention is that the main function of this memorial, its primary purpose and effect, was political mobilization. It very successfully transformed Kirk's quite contentious, often aggressive legacy into fuel for immediate political action and, importantly, long-term movement growth.
Okay, let me start then focusing on the spiritual weight of that moment, the overwhelming emphasis from the speakers on stage. Despite Kirk's well-known political activism, was really on his identity as a man of faith, a martyr, even for Christian values. And the most critical moment, I think we'd agree, was the message from his widow, Erica Kirk. It felt very raw, unfiltered, deeply spiritual. She delivered this message of radical Christian forgiveness. I mean, not just political tolerance, but real grace, saying, I forgive him because it was what Christ did. And she followed that immediately with a direct call, choose Christ. Now, the impact reported by people there, well, it speaks volumes. They talked about seeing people opening Bibles for the first time in years, praying for perhaps the first time since they were children. It even seemed to move President Trump, who described the atmosphere, didn't he, as like an old-time revival. It felt like genuine Christian testimony, rooted in real faith, just given this enormous national platform.
I understand that perspective, and I wouldn't question the authenticity of Erica Kirk's personal faith. But the staging, the overall purpose, and the ultimate effect, I think that was fundamentally political. We have to look at the context. This was an unprecedented political show of force. Let's not forget, the Department of Homeland Security designated this memorial as an event of the highest national significance. That's a status usually reserved for things like the Super Bowl or major national security events. That designation alone tells you something about its political and organizational weight. And beyond that, the spiritual language, however genuine from some, was immediately put to use, instrumentalized. Figures like Jeff Sharlet, who, studies Christian nationalism, pointed out how the rhetoric quickly morphed into talk of holy war and, significantly, accelerationism. And just for our listeners, accelerationism in this context basically means using a sense of crisis, like a tragedy or feeling persecuted, to rapidly speed up political demands and push for immediate, pretty aggressive policy changes. The movement, I'd argue, very successfully used this tragedy to rebrand a political activist as a religious martyr, which then supercharged the political youth engine he built.
Okay, let's dig into that tension. The first point of contention really is this paradox, forgiveness versus retribution.
Right. You focus on Erica Kirk's forgiveness message at the core. But that moment was almost immediately dramatically overshadowed, perhaps even hijacked. And that juxtaposition, I think, is key to understanding the event's political function. We heard this profound, radical grace, yes. But literally right after she spoke, President Trump stepped up and, he escalated promises of political retribution against opponents. He famously said regarding his enemies, something like, he hates my opponent and I don't want the best for them. That contrast it's quite jarring. It fundamentally reframes the event. It uses that powerful, genuine emotion of grace almost as an amplifier, maybe even a moral cover for really intense partisan antagonism.
I see why you think that reasoning is strong, but I think it overlooks the specific nature of spiritual mobilization within this particular movement. The spiritual call could still have been dominant for the audience precisely because the political figures were framing the fight in spiritual terms. The goal wasn't necessarily to negate the forgiveness, but maybe to frame the political action as a necessary, righteous consequence of that faith. Think about Erica Kirk's broader challenge, especially to the women there, to be virtuous and to focus on motherhood as the single most important ministry. That speaks directly to mobilizing a deep cultural and spiritual revival within the movement, not just simple political payback against Democrats. It taps into this conviction that the culture itself needs saving, starting at the family level, which then, in their view, gives moral authority to the political fight.
That's an interesting framing, though. I'd put it slightly differently. The political figures weren't just legitimizing the fight, they were actively demanding antagonism. J.D. Vance made this quite explicit, didn't he? He argued Kirk would reject a fake kumbaya moment and urged the political work must continue to defend America. And Benny Johnson, who's a key figure in conservative media mobilization, went even further. He demanded the Trump administration carry out a godly mission of wielding the sword against evil. So the spiritual component isn't really a separate track. It's what gives the political fight its moral imperative. The underlying message becomes, we are forgiven, yes, but they, our political opponents, they aren't worthy of that same grace because they represent evil.
I have to push back a bit on that interpretation. Focusing only on the resulting political rhetoric risks overlooking the deep cultural current that's driving this movement. Remember, Marco Rubio delivered a full gospel presentation. Tucker Carlson explicitly said Kirk knew politics couldn't answer the deepest questions, and he urged repentance, worshiping Jesus. Now that is undeniably genuine evangelism happening on a major national stage. If the political talk was just cynical exploitation, why dedicate so much time to pure theological instruction and calls for conversion? The source material shows that TPUSA Faith even provided resources for people who stood up to receive Jesus as their Savior. The spiritual mechanism seems to be running in parallel and arguably runs deeper than the immediate political machinery.
Well, perhaps it's about blending the two seamlessly. The conversion calls create a grassroots base that's galvanized by this shared sense of spiritual sacrifice, which arguably makes them far more effective, more committed than your typical political rally crowd.
Okay, which brings us to the second point. How do we define Kirk's legacy as cemented by this event? Was it primarily as a political organizer or as a spiritual hero?
Let's define Kirk's actual functional legacy, the one institutionalized by this memorial. Was he mainly a theologian, or was he a highly effective political organizer whose stock in trade was confrontation? I mean, his entire career was built on that aggressive debate style. His stated goal was to verbally defeat his opponents. He generated content that reportedly yielded 2 billion views leading up to the 2024 election. His influence was built on sharp-elbowed culture war conservatism. The memorial, I believe, confirmed and institutionalized that political legacy. And we should probably define the term friend-enemy distinction here for our audience. It's a concept really central to aggressive political movements, where the goal isn't about finding common ground or objective truth, but about clearly identifying your opponent as an existential enemy. And that's something Kirk had mastered.
I'm just not convinced that the political nature completely outweighs the spiritual impact. His legacy, as defined by his wife at that service, was profoundly spiritual. His life was framed as a miracle, a turning point for the country. So to label him simply as an aggressive political organizer seems to miss the immense power of the martyrdom narrative that the memorial cemented. That narrative that he died defending Christian faith, that's what's inspiring young people like James Swank Jr. mentioned at Texas A&M to infuse scripture into their political arguments, to sign up for debate clubs. This is precisely what conservative activists often mean when they argue that politics is just an on-ramp to Jesus. The cultural momentum seems driven by this belief that the struggle is a righteous, spiritual war for the nation's soul.
But the delivery mechanism for that spiritual urgency is a political powerhouse. You have Florida Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna declaring, "We are all Charlie Kirk now," vowing the assassin failed because the message became bigger and better. That doesn't sound like quiet spiritual transformation. That sounds like movement galvanization, capitalizing on a tragedy to ensure the machine keeps running and those 2 billion views keep converting into political action. The legacy being actively carried forward isn't just quiet faith, it's the highly aggressive antagonistic campus activism that TPUSA is built on, the kind that views every political opponent not as someone to persuade, but as an enemy to be defeated.
That may be the functional political outcome, yes, but the long-term spiritual consequence is what we also need to consider. He was hailed repeatedly as a martyr for the Christian faith. The material suggests his death has fundamentally shifted the discourse for his followers, ensuring that faith is now integrated into almost every political argument they make. This fusion means that even if the debates are aggressive, they're now viewed, by them at least, through the lens of defending divine moral truth. I believe the spiritual framework cemented at that service is what gives the political movement its ongoing resilience.
Which leads nicely into our third point, the endurance of that TPUSA machine.
Exactly.
Let's talk about resilience in very concrete terms. The organization Kirk built, Turning Point USA, it's a powerful, extremely well-funded political asset. TPUSA reported raising, $85 million in 2023, and it boasts over 900 college chapters. The memorial very successfully projected this organizational strength. And the immediate consequence of the event was rapid political action, transforming a personal tragedy into institutional leverage. We saw an almost immediate crackdown, or attempted crackdown, on free speech aimed at his critics. Jimmy Kimmel's show facing indefinite suspension threats from the FCC. Reports of employers being pressured to fire people who spoke negatively about Kirk online. The event provided the immediate justification for government pressure and corporate attempts to control discourse, demonstrating real political power in action.
That's a compelling point based on the financials and the institutional power, certainly. But have you considered the potential organizational fragility that the memorial might have also exposed? I mean, Candace Owens' subsequent warning about not putting a shill in Charlie Kirk's chair, that reveals pretty deep internal political stakes, right? Struggles for control over this massive asset. If this was such a seamless, unified political machine, why the very public infighting over leadership succession almost immediately after the tragedy? That might suggest the political machinery is perhaps more volatile than it appears.
I have to push back slightly against that framing. Infighting over control of an $85 million war chest and a youth army spanning 900 chapters isn't necessarily a sign of fragility. I'd argue it's a sign of its immense political value. The stakes are incredibly high precisely because the machine is so effective. Furthermore, let's go back to the DHS designation. The decision to label the memorial an event of highest national significance meant the government itself acknowledged the political and security weight of that gathering. It confirms the state viewed it primarily as a major political mobilization effort, not just a religious service. And that designation, of course, guaranteed maximum security and attention, which only helped facilitate the political messaging.
But the organizational stability, I think, is secondary to the motivating ideology. The reported surge in chapter requests and donations right after the assassination suggests the movement was genuinely galvanized by a shared sense of spiritual sacrifice, a belief in a greater mission, rooted in common Christian conservative values. Kirk's enduring belief, the one often quoted, was that politics is just an on-ramp to Jesus. The memorial arguably ensured that the TPUSA machine, regardless of who eventually sits in the CEO chair, will likely continue to operate under that spiritual mandate. The machine seems sustained by that spiritual conviction, not just the budget alone.
But the budget and the political outcomes are completely intertwined with the conviction. The question isn't really whether faith was present clearly. It was. The question is whether the authentic spiritual awakening described by some observers could realistically coexist alongside the immediate political calls for wielding the sword against evil and actively silencing critics. The evidence strongly suggests, in my view, that the political forces very quickly and effectively absorbed that spiritual energy to accelerate their already highly antagonistic agenda.
So we've thoroughly explored this dual nature of the Charlie Kirk Memorial. On one hand, a moment of what seems like authentic spiritual grief and even conversion, powerfully highlighted by Erica Kirk's message of forgiveness and the calls to Christ. And on the other hand, simultaneously,
a highly sophisticated political mobilization effort leveraged by Republican leaders to intensify antagonism and issue calls for action against political opponents.
Yeah, the debate really illuminates that powerful and often contradictory fusion of Christian nationalist rhetoric and high-stakes political strategy that now defines a significant part of American conservatism. That tension between radical grace and immediate retribution is perhaps one of the most defining characteristics of the movement Kirk was so central in shaping.
And we invite you, our audience, to really engage with this profound tension. Think about how these dual forces, the spiritual and the political, shape your own understanding of modern engagement. Did the memorial signal a new beginning for faith, where maybe genuine spiritual awakening can actually transcend the political sphere? Or did it ultimately confirm the power of yielding power, where political strategies successfully absorbed and instrumentalized spiritual sacrifice for its own ends? Let us know, write N or Y in the comments below. We really encourage you to reflect on what this truly monumental moment means for the future direction of the conservative movement, and we appreciate you, our KaiZen audience, for joining this important discourse today.